I know I say this for every ranking video, but this is really going to be fun. So with the release of Black Panther Wakanda Forever, the final movie in MCU Phase 4, there are now 30 MCU movies total, so I thought it was a perfect time for me to rank all 30 of them from worst to best. My first time ranking all the MCU movies. I know I've done a tier list before, but this will be like the first time doing a proper ranking, and I'll actually do a character tier list soon, so stay tuned for that. I love the MCU. I'm an unabashed MCU fan. I think a vast majority of their movies are at least good, and some of them are great, and there are only a few that I would really consider bad. So with that being said, let's get into it. Number 30 is going to be Iron Man 3. I hate this movie. I always have. I tried to give it another shot a few years ago, watching it for the first time after seeing it in theaters. The first half-ish of this movie is not bad. I like that they set up the Mandarin as this badass, compelling, threatening villain, and the exploration of PTSD with Tony. I like the character stuff there and his interactions with the kid. There is some interesting stuff in the first part of this movie. Unfortunately, once the Mandarin twist happens, it completely falls off a cliff for me. Not just because of the Mandarin twist, which I think is incredibly stupid. You take this badass, compelling villain and turn him into a joke. This guy that's burping and talking about, ooh, don't go in there for 15 minutes. And then trade him in for Aldrich Killian, who is one of the most generic villains in the entire MCU, and there's a lot of generic villains. I love the MCU, but they definitely had a villain problem, especially early on. And he has a backstory that we've seen a million times with the Riddler and with Syndrome and with Electro. Didn't find him compelling at all. He kidnaps the president for reasons, and the third act just didn't find interesting and care for the Extremis plot line and the Super Pepper stuff. So a movie that has some interesting ideas and starts off pretty good, but completely loses me once the Mandarin twist happens. Number 29 is going to be The Incredible Hulk. This is just a movie that I don't really have much to say about. I find it incredibly forgettable. I think Edward Norton is a solid lead character. He's about the only part of this movie that I like, aside from maybe the third act, which I think is a little bit overrated, but still decent. Everything else in this movie I find to be incredibly dull and forgettable. It doesn't really have a tone. It's like they kind of wanted to have a dark tone, but didn't fully commit to it, so it just ends up being extremely dull, and there's like no jokes in there at all, and I did not care for the romance plotline whatsoever. I thought that Liv Tyler, I don't know if it was her or the writing or the directing, but she was atrocious in this movie. Her line delivery, her dialogue, her interactions with Bruce Banner, definitely the worst stuff of the movie. Just don't really care for this one. It doesn't do very many things to actively piss me off like the Mandarin twist, but I also don't really have any reason to watch it again. Speaking of forgettable, number 29 is going to be Thor: The Dark World. I talked about generic villains. Malekith might be the most generic villain in the entire MCU. Lines are super generic and cliche, and I don't even really understand his plan and what he was trying to do. The only saving grace of this movie is the Thor and Loki interactions. I thought there is some good stuff there. They're always enjoyable on screen together, and Loki's reaction to his mom's death I thought was pretty well done, but it's kind of trying to be so many different things, and the Earth stuff was just awful. I mean, I enjoy Kat Dennings' character in WandaVision a lot more than I did in the first two Thor movies, and I especially did enjoy her in this one. And the fact that she has like her own intern, the intern has an intern, I found that incredibly cringy and not funny at all. This movie is not horrible. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen. It didn't piss me off, but definitely one of the most forgettable movies in the entire MCU, with one of the most forgettable villains, if not the most forgettable villain, and an incredibly forgettable third act. Number 27 is going to be Iron Man 2. This one, I think there's enough fun to be had there. Anytime Robert Downey Jr. plays Iron Man, he's going to be fun, entertaining, charismatic. He has great chemistry with basically every character he interacts with and kind of elevates the entire cast around him. I really enjoy Justin Hammer, played by Sam Rockwell. I think he is the best part of this movie. He is hilarious and awesome, and I really hope they bring him back at some point. The dancing scene with him is one of the most iconic scenes in the entire MCU. I like furthering the relationship between Tony and Pepper. Unfortunately, there is just way too many things going on in this movie, way too many plot lines. You have the Whiplash stuff with I don't think was done well at all. I think Mickey Rourke's performance was really weird. He phoned it in and disappears for a majority of the movie, and there isn't really a central conflict for a vast portion of this movie. You have the stuff with Tony dying and trying to discover a new element, his daddy issues, even though I really did enjoy the scene with him watching the clip of his dad saying, like, my greatest creation of you. That was well done. And then you have all the Avengers set up with Nick Fury and Natasha, even though I did enjoy her in this movie. Just way too many moving parts in this movie, and doesn't feel like its own movie. It feels like it's just trying to set up future MCU projects, so doesn't work that well overall as a movie, even though I get some level of enjoyment out of it. Number 26 is going to be the first Thor. I like this a little bit more than the second one, mainly because of the Asgardian stuff early in the movie. I liked a lot of that. I love the casting of Thor and Loki and Odin, all great castings, the interactions between them, all the Shakespearean stuff. I thought that was really cool. I like the idea of taking Thor's powers and banishing him. Loki is great in this movie. Tom Hiddleston steals every scene that he's in. He's great in every MCU project and everything I've ever seen him in. Unfortunately, the Earth stuff is incredibly forgettable and kind of slams on the brakes for any real conflict in the movie. I don't buy the Thor and Jane relationship at all in this movie. It is one of the worst romances in the entire MCU. Did not have any chemistry in this movie. So every time we went back to the Earth stuff, I was incredibly bored. And I thought that Laufey was a potentially interesting villain, but was kind of wasted in the end. So there is enough to like about this movie. Casting's good, Asgardian stuff, but the Earth stuff is not good. And the third act isn't very good either. There isn't really a central villain throughout the movie. Number 25, and it really pains me to put this here, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. This has to be the most disappointing theater experience I've ever had with an MCU movie, and maybe just a movie, period. My expectations were so high for this movie. The concept was so cool. It lends itself to doing so many cool and unique things, but it just doesn't. I mean, it calls itself Multiverse of Madness, but they don't do anything even remotely interesting with the multiverse. I mean, the most they ever do is have pizza in a bowl and go on red and stop on green. Wow, very creative, guys. Very well done in that regard for a movie called Multiverse of Madness. And then aside from that, I just did not like the characterization of Wanda whatsoever. Elizabeth Olsen's performance is phenomenal. She eats it up. She kills it. But, well, pun intended with the kills it thing, I just did not buy that this character would be in this place given where we left off with her at the end of WandaVision. It was too much of a jump for me. It was too jarring that she was now so casually willing to kill so many people. And people will say it's because of the Darkhold. I don't like that either. That feels lazy to have this device or inanimate object taking someone over so that they're not the actual villain and not really responsible for anything they do. And if they were going to do that, flesh that out. Make the movie about her slowly succumbing to the temptations of the Darkhold and have her become the villain by the end. But don't start off with her just being super villainous. That was super jarring. That being said, there are elements of this movie that I enjoy. The action was cool. The visuals are great. I loved a lot of the horror aesthetics and vibes, and the score was really good. The performances were great. So it's a movie that has a lot of enjoyment factor to it. I certainly like the inclusion of America Chavez. I thought she was great, very likable character. So despite my large issues with this movie, I still think there is enough enjoyment to be had while watching it. Number 24 is going to be Captain Marvel. I think this movie is fine. I don't dislike it like a lot of people do. I don't think it's amazing, but I think it has enough merit to it. I think Brie Larson is okay in the role. I don't think it's a problem with miscasting. I think it's a problem with the writing in this movie, and I'm glad that they got different writers and directors for the second one. Just too many writers in this movie in general. It doesn't really have a great flow to it. You can tell that there were kind of several different things that they were trying to do. That being said, I really, really love Nick Fury in this movie. This might be the best Nick Fury. He's not the jaded, cynical Nick Fury that we get in the MCU movies that take place, later in time. And the de-aging CGI on him looks incredible. Looks like they plucked him right out of the 90s and put him into this movie. There's some humor that works. Some of the humor doesn't work super well, but I actually really like the Skrull stuff. I love Ben Mendelsohn as a Skrull, and I like the twist that the Skrulls, at least in this movie, were actually good. I didn't see that coming. I did see Jude Law's character being bad coming. He's certainly towards the bottom of the MCU villains, but overall, this is a movie that I think has enough enjoyment factor to it, and I don't hate Brie Larson in the role nearly as much as most people do, but Nick Fury is definitely the best part of this movie, so I enjoy it when I watch it, even though it's definitely got some issues. Number 23 is going to be Captain America: The First Avenger. I'm kind of mixed positive on this one. I appreciated it a little bit more when I watched it again a few years ago before watching Endgame. There are aspects of this movie that I think are really well done. I think that Chris Evans was a great pick to play Captain America, and I love how he's just this good guy who doesn't want to kill anyone, but, he doesn't like bullies no matter where they're from. Guy with a great moral compass who's unwavering in that way. I love the stuff with Peggy Carter, and there is definitely some cool action in this movie. Don't love how they montage through the World War II, and I honestly think this is probably a hot take, but I think the Bucky stuff is a bit underdeveloped in this movie. I think the reason we come to love Bucky is what they do in the later movies. I don't think we got nearly enough of him to feel his loss in this movie specifically. And then Red Skull, I certainly enjoy Hugo Weaving's performance, and that's what makes him somewhat compelling and somewhat watchable as a villain, but the actual character himself is an incredibly generic villain. So it's a movie that I enjoy and appreciate a little bit more on rewatch, but it is easily the weakest of the Captain America movies. Number 22 is going to be Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I absolutely love the first Guardians of the Galaxy. You're going to see that way higher on this list. Unfortunately, I like this one, but I had a lot more issues with it than I did with the first one. First of all, there isn't really much of a central conflict for a large majority of this movie, and I think that is something that is needed for most MCU movies. It kind of feels like they're meandering for a while, and the villains are just crap in this movie. I mean, I love Kurt Russell. Kurt Russell is awesome, but they somehow found a way to make him dull in this movie, and the gold people are even more dull. The humor was a lot more hit or miss in this movie than it was in the first one. In the first one, I thought almost all the humor landed and felt really organic and fresh. In this one, it just felt like they tried a little bit too hard to just throw joke after joke after joke at you. And some landed, some definitely did not. And I don't really like the stuff with Drax being like overly mean to Mantis. That was just, they went a little bit too far with that. That being said, I still enjoy the hell out of seeing these characters on screen. It has a great soundtrack again. A lot of the humor does land, a lot of the character stuff does land, and there is certainly some cool action. So I enjoyed enough, but I have a lot more issues with this one than I do with the first one, so that's why it's quite a ways down. Number 21, oh boy, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. I've only seen this movie once. It certainly could move one way or the other, but as of right now, this is where I stand on it. I think it's a good movie, not a great movie. It's quite a bit of a step down from the first one. To me, I have some issues with it. But the performances are excellent across the board, especially Angela Bassett. She is incredible, brings all the emotion, all of the gravitas, should absolutely get nominated for a Best Supporting Actress Oscar. Everyone else is great. A lot of great character interactions here that are elevated by the performances. Great emotional beats. I love the themes explored here of grief and loss and anger and rage. The visuals, I think, are a pretty big step up from the first one. For the most part, especially the underwater stuff, looks incredible. The score by Ludwig Göransson is once again great. I love almost everything about Namor, his intimidation factor, the fact that he can be likable at times. The performance is great. The visualization, aside from some wonky CGI, sometimes is great. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily buy into his motivations completely. I don't feel like they did quite enough work there. I think that the movie is just too long and overstuffed. There is too many plot lines. I think they could have cut out the Ironheart subplot and the Everett Ross subplot, and the movie wouldn't have really suffered for it, but you would have been 20 to 25 minutes shorter. So that kind of bloated the runtime a little bit. Some of the action was mixed to me. Some of the hand-to-hand action was pretty good, but once again, the final battle was underwhelming. CGI wasn't great, and I felt like the final battle was too small scale for what it should have been, and just they had to work the real-life tragedy of Chadwick Boseman into this, and I feel like given the direction they decided to take, they did a fairly good job with that, of working it into the fictional story, but it also, given everything else the movie was already trying to do, makes the movie feel a little bit wonky and inconsistent emotionally and structurally sometimes. So it is a good movie, but one that I have some issues with. Number 20 is going to be the original Doctor Strange. I like this movie, and I rewatched it recently, and I still like it. It's definitely not a top-tier MCU movie. You can definitely feel the MCU formula in this one. It definitely feels like, plot-wise, it's very similar to Iron Man. It definitely feels like a very generic MCU origin story that we've already seen several times. And Benedict Cumberbatch in this movie, I actually like him a lot more in the Avengers movies. In this one, he feels like just kind of a ripoff of Tony Stark, who is not nearly as likable, but he does have a good arc in the movie, and the visuals are incredible. I mean, it looks like some Inception type stuff that they infuse into the MCU. I thought the dark dimension and the mirror dimension, a lot of that stuff was really well done. Villain Mads Mikkelsen, Caecilius, one of the more generic and forgettable villains in the MCU, but I really like the stuff with the Ancient One. I really like the stuff with Chiwetel Ejiofor. I don't really like what they did with him in Multiverse of Madness, but awesome this movie, and I hope we get to see our version of the character again. So there's some cool stuff in here, but it is certainly not perfect and is pretty formulaic. Number 19 is going to be Thor: Love and Thunder. I enjoyed this one a lot more than a lot of people did. I certainly have some issues with it. I don't think it balanced the tone nearly as well as Ragnarok did. I feel like it would really drastically shift at times to being like so over the top goofy to being like really scary. And I thought the scary stuff with Gore worked really well on its own, and Christian Bale's performance was excellent. Gore is one of the better MCU villains, probably top 10, but could have been top 5 if he was fleshed out a little bit more. And then you'd go from that to like super goofy stuff. I don't feel like that was balanced super well. That being said, a lot of the humorous, the comedy, a lot of that stuff landed for me. I know it didn't for a lot of people. People got mad about the goats. The goats, once they put them on the back burner and then brought them back, they made me laugh again. Most of the humor landed for me. The emotional beats landed for me. I don't really understand the people saying that the emotional beats didn't land, that it was undercut by the humor. No, I mean, when the movie had to be serious, it was. And the stuff with Jane and Thor, I thought was really good. They finally get me to buy into this relationship for the first time in this franchise. I thought they should never go back to it, but Taika was able to pull it off. There's some cool visuals and action in here. I love the Russell Crowe stuff. Some people hated it. I thought it was perfect for what this movie was trying to say. So I enjoy Thor: Love and Thunder, despite it certainly being like a lesser version of Thor Ragnarok that wasn't able to find the balance between goofiness and seriousness that Ragnarok did. Number 18 is going to be the first Ant-Man. This movie is just a lot of fun. It is a small-scale, safe MCU movie that knows exactly what it is. It's a heist movie within the MCU. Paul Rudd is a lot of fun as Ant-Man. He was a perfect pick and is great in the lead. I like the inclusion of Michael Douglas and Evangeline Lilly and Michael Pena. Does suffer from the generic MCU villain who has similar abilities as our hero, kind of like Ironmonger in the first Iron Man movie. They kind of redid that whole thing in this one, but it is a lot of fun, and the idea of Ant-Man sounds kind of goofy on paper, but I think they executed it pretty well, and certainly one of the funniest MCU movies. The Ant-Man franchise is very funny, and I was never bored while watching this movie. I can watch the Ant-Man movies over and over. They're just so much fun. Smaller scale, safer MCU movies that don't nearly hit the highs of the best ones, but they're definitely entertaining. Number 17 is going to be Spider-Man: Homecoming. Another just simple, safe MCU movie that is pulled off quite well. It feels like a high school movie. We've seen a lot of high school movies that are like this, but it just has the MCU kind of filter over it. And I don't love that Peter is like Iron Man Jr. in this movie. Not that Tony is his mentor, which I think is fine. I actually like Robert Downey Jr.'s inclusion in this movie. I like how he was weaved into the story, but I'm talking about the technology itself. We don't get a chance to see just regular Spider-Man. He just goes right into this crazy Stark technology, so I wasn't super fond of that. The third act is one of the most underwhelming third acts in the MCU. There isn't great action throughout this movie, but what really elevates it to me is Michael Keaton's Vulture. One of the best villains in the entire MCU, one of the best performances in the entire MCU. When Peter opens that door and sees him there, and you get the holy shit moment, and then the car scene, just some of the best character interactions and showcases of pure acting in the entire MCU. So honestly, if it wasn't for Vulture, the movie would probably be in like maybe even my bottom 5 or 10 MCU movies, but he certainly elevates it to good status. A lot of people have this in like their top 5 MCU movies. I don't understand that for the life of me. I think that the top ones are a lot more ambitious and they deliver on those ambitions. This one knows exactly what it is. It's a safe, small scale, fun high school movie that is set in the MCU with a very likable Peter Parker and Tom Holland and a great villain. Number 16 is going to be Ant-Man and the Wasp. Just like the first one, this is a very fun and enjoyable movie that knows exactly what it is. The reason I prefer this one slightly is because I like Evangeline Lilly a lot better in this one. She actually gets to fight. She gets to be a badass. She's a little bit more likable. I kind of didn't like her in the first one. She kind of came across as pretty unlikable to me, so she was much more enjoyable in this one. Again, the Ant-Man series is struggling with villains a little bit. I certainly think and hope that that will change in the next one. But this movie definitely has a villain problem. Walton Goggins' character is super generic and forgettable. And you get Ghost, who is not really a full-on villain, but is somewhat of an anti-hero and is somewhat interesting, but not quite as interesting as she could have been. Michael Pena is always amazing in everything that he's in, especially the MCU movies, one of the funniest characters. And this movie is just as funny and just as fun as the first one. So I always am entertained. I could watch, again, like I said, Ant-Man and the Wasp. I could watch these movies over and over. They're just very easy to digest MCU movies. Number 15 is going to be Black Widow. A lot of people don't really like this movie, and I thought it was pretty good. Aside from the third act, which is easily the weakest part of this movie, brings it down quite a bit, becomes a super generic MCU CGI final battle. One shot in particular has awful CGI, and people have been making fun of this scene a lot with Yelena. I don't really understand what the hell that was. Villains were terrible. Ray Winstone's character was super generic and over the top, and Taskmaster was very, very underwhelming. Everything else I thought worked really well for this movie. I love the family dynamic. That is the strong point of this movie by far. The performances, Florence Pugh as Yelena and David Harbour, and their interactions with each other and with Natasha and with their mom, played by Rachel Weisz. I thought all of that was great. Definitely the best part of the movie, and that takes up a majority of the movie. So that's why I thought it worked. And a lot of the action, aside from the third act, I thought was pretty good too. A lot of the hand-to-hand stuff. I love the idea of these girls getting kidnapped as young kids and then ending up overthrowing, the people that did this to them. Cool idea, and you get to kind of see that in the opening credits, which is by far and away the best opening credits in the entire MCU. The different take on Smells Like Teen Spirit, that was incredibly well done. So despite issues with the third act, it brings it down quite a bit. I quite enjoy Black Widow. Number 14 is going to be Spider-Man Far From Home. A lot of people seem to hate this movie now. I don't really understand why. I have some issues with certain things. Like, I don't really like the idea that Tony would give his glasses with all of these capabilities of like launching nukes and stuff and drones and stuff to this kid who he thought was dead at the time and is not even an adult yet. Very strange decision, and that brings the movie down quite a bit. Mysterio, it's a bit of a logic leap for me that he goes from disgruntled employee to willing to casually kill so many people. Although Gyllenhaal's performance was excellent, and aside from that, I love what they did with Mysterio in this movie, even though we knew he was going to be bad. The scene in the bar where he reveals that he's bad and kind of lets all the illusions down that he had up, and it's like, well, that wasn't too hard. I thought that was incredible, and that gives me chills every time I watch it. The interactions between him and Peter, both before and after the reveal, I think are really good. And Peter kind of dealing with the loss of Tony Stark, I thought was really well done in this movie. It has way better action and a third act than Spider-Man Homecoming did. So and great visuals too. Like, you wouldn't think a Spider-Man movie would have this great of visuals, but the Mysterio illusion stuff I thought was incredible. So despite a couple big issues that bring this movie down quite a bit, I thought that Far From Home was quite well done and an improvement over the first one. Number 13, another movie that a lot of people seem to hate is Eternals. I really don't understand hate for this movie. I don't think it's perfect. It is probably a little bit too long, and the plot isn't structured in a way that is great, and I don't like Sprite as a character at all. But I thought this movie worked as a whole. I thought it had great character development for one movie. I talk about how, like, the MCU is great character development, but that's over several movies, like over several years getting to know these people. I thought Eternals did a really good job developing all these new characters within one movie. I came to really care about them by the end, and the emotional beats landed for me. I thought the action was really cool, so I just don't really, and I love the expansion of the lore and mythology in the MCU. We get to see a totally different side that we haven't seen before. I don't get the hate for this one, and it's certainly not perfect, but I remember quite liking it when I saw it. Number 12 is going to be Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This was almost a top-tier MC movie. Again, the third act lets it down. It becomes a very generic CGI busy battle, just way too much going on, and kind of undermines what the rest of the movie was. That being said, the rest of the movie was great. I love Shang-Chi as a character. This has some of the best action in the entire MCU as far as like smaller scale action, and I really wish they would have just stuck to the smaller scale stuff and don't have so much CGI because it was so well done. It's one of the best and most complex villains in the entire MCU with Shang-Chi's dad. I thought that he was really well characterized because he's doing the wrong thing, but you completely understand why he's doing it and you feel for him. I thought Awkwafina's inclusion was fun in this movie. Wong, it's always fun to see him. So there's a lot to like about this movie, but the third act just brings it down a little bit. Number 11 is going to be Avengers Age of Ultron. This is easily the most underrated MCU movie to me. A lot of people hate on this one, calling it a bad movie. I have never understood that. In fact, it is almost as good as the first one to me. There are days where I think that it might be as good, if not better than the first one. I think it does a lot of stuff better. I think that they go a little bit deeper into the characters, and I love the stuff between Tony and Steve kind of planting the seeds for their confrontation in Civil War. I think Ultron is quite a good villain. I wish they would have been a little bit more serious with him and not had all the quips, but it also kind of makes sense that he has the quips because he was created by Tony Stark. And then this is also kind of the beginning of Tony Stark feeling the guilt and why he ends up on the side that he does in Age of Ultron. The movie has great action throughout. I love the third act. I mean, it does feel like a little bit of a repeat of the first one, just fighting robots instead of aliens, but I think it still works. I think it was still really well done. I like the introduction of Wanda and Quicksilver, and Quicksilver's death is really heartbreaking, mainly because of Wanda's reaction, and you see in that reaction just how unhinged she can be sometimes when she can't control her powers. But Elizabeth Olsen is gives some of the best performances in the MCU as Scarlet Witch, and starting with this movie, I thought she was excellent. I enjoy Age of Ultron. I like it quite a bit. I think it is damn good. A lot of people say that the farm stuff with Clint was a cheap attempt at character development. I thought it was fine. I thought it was legitimate character development, and we barely got to know him in the first movie, so getting to know him a little bit more in this one, I was totally fine with, and the character interactions were great. I do not get the hate for this one. It is a bit messy at times. The Thor bathtub scene is very strange that they decided to put that in the spot of this movie that they did. It really tanks the pacing. That's about the only real problem I have with it, aside from, again, Ultron not being quite as good as he could have, and the third act feeling a bit repetitive, but I think Age of Ultron is awesome. Number 10 is going to be the first Black Panther. First one is great, and everything in my top 10 I would consider to be great to like all-time great movies. Black Panther is not perfect. It definitely suffers from the CGI final battle that a lot of MCU movies, particularly both Black Panther movies, suffer from. But aside from that, I think everything else is really well done. I think that Killmonger is one of the best villains in the entire MCU, someone who is doing really villainous things, but you completely understand why, given what happened to him when he was a kid. And then you have the flip side with T'Challa, and then Killmonger gets defeated in the end, but kind of wins the moral victory, and T'Challa changes his mind about how Wakanda is going to operate. A lot of the action is great, especially the stuff where between T'Challa and M'Baku, and then later T'Challa versus Killmonger for the throne. I thought those fights were really well done. The side characters are all excellent. Shuri, Okoye, Nakia, Queen Ramonda. It's just such a great cast of characters, such a cool world that Wakanda is, and I love the themes, real deep themes being explored in this movie, and kind of the moral dilemma that Killmonger poses for T'Challa and how he realizes his dad was a hypocrite. Great stuff in this movie, even though the third act is about the only thing I can hold against it. Number 9 is going to be the original Iron Man. This one still holds up so well. Robert Downey Jr. was the perfect pick. He was born to play Tony Stark, and he just has such, like I said before, such great chemistry with every single actor and elevates them. The movie didn't even really have a script for a while, so much of this was improv, and that makes it feel more real to me. Like, it feels like these characters are actually having these interactions, and Downey was so good at that. I really like Obadiah Stane as a villain. I don't love how he goes out and how the third act plays out to where he becomes like a villain with the same abilities as the hero, and I wish they would have carried him over into the second movie. That's about my only issue with the movie. It is very funny, but it's not overly funny. It doesn't become too jokey like some of the MCU movie does. The humor is placed very well. We are very invested in Tony and his story and his relationship with Pepper, and stuff that happens in the cave in the beginning with the Yinsen I thought was really well done, and we slowly get to see him build this Iron Man suit, which is incredibly compelling, like way more than it should be. There isn't that much action in this movie, but it's never boring because of how good Robert Downey Jr. is and how invested we are in his story and his character arc of learning that his weapons are killing innocent people and finally realizing that he's got to shut it down and do the right thing, and that's why he becomes a hero. I thought all of that was so well done. I actually really like Terrence Howard as Rhodey. I wish we would have got to see him continue. I don't know if I want to say he's better than Don Cheadle, but he's a different version of the character that I wish we would have gotten to see more of him. Obviously, it's never going to happen, but there is so much to love about this movie, and I remember watching it for the first time, like, who the hell is Iron Man? I've never heard of this guy, and damn, that was awesome. That was so cool. The great soundtrack. I mean, the movie is just so much better than it had any right to be, and because of its success, we now have the MCU that we have. Number 8 is going to be the original Avengers. This one I've always thought was great, maybe gone down a little bit for me recently, doesn't age super well, but I think for the most part the movie works quite well. Loki is one of the best villains in the entire MCU, and until Thanos was probably the best villain in the entire MCU. The dialogue and banter between the characters is great. Joss Whedon is a shitty person, but he is really good at that kind of thing. The witty banter, and that is very much showcased in this movie, especially between Tony and Steve. We get a little bit of hints of the rivalry in this movie. This is kind of like where it starts a little bit. We don't get the reasons like we start to see in Age of Ultron, but it just moves it along just a little bit to give us little hints of what's going to happen down the line. There's some cool action in this movie. It has one of the best third acts in the entire MCU, the Avengers teaming up for the first time against the entire army of Chitauri. Is that what they're called? Chitauri? Yeah, Chitauri. I thought that was really cool. The movie does drag a little bit in places, and the production value isn't amazing. It kind of looks like a TV movie at times, and the Captain America suit is awful. But I think that everything else works very well for this movie, and if nothing else, just to see these characters all team up on screen for the first time. Number 7 is going to be Spider-Man No Way Home. This one was so satisfying. There are certainly some issues I have with it. It's not perfect. I don't really like the setup with all the decisions that Doctor Strange makes. He seems pretty careless about the whole thing, not really talking things through with Peter, who's also being quite careless, and then the semantics of the spell itself. But once things get set into motion, I think everything else works really well. I love seeing all these villains again, especially Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin, who is incredible, gives an excellent performance, one of the best performances in the MCU in this movie, and he's way better than he was in the first one, which he was already great. Seeing Alfred Molina again was awesome. Jamie Foxx, I think, as Electro is much better in this movie than he was in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, even though it doesn't really make any sense. He kind of just becomes Jamie Foxx. It still worked a lot better for me. The rest of the villains were sidelined a little bit, but it was still cool to see them. Those three I thought were really well done, and the Aunt May death was certainly what this Peter needed, because this Peter, Tom Holland's Peter, had not really gotten an origin story yet. So what we come to realize is that this trilogy, the MCU Tom Holland trilogy, is his version of an origin story, and I thought that was really well done. Aunt May ends up given the line, "With great power comes great responsibility." She's like the new Uncle Ben. That was great. And then Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire coming in. I was a bit worried that it was just going to be like a fan service. They were going to show up to say hi and be cameos. No, they actually felt necessary in the movie. Their inclusion felt like they had a purpose, like they were there to remind Peter of who he is and how he operates and what he does. I thought that was really well done. I loved all of the interactions between those three different versions of Spider-Man, both the humorous interactions and the serious interactions. I thought all that stuff was so well done, and it was so cool to see. And then the final battle with those three and all of the villains, just great stuff in there. And then Peter versus Green Goblin at the end, and then Toby stopping him, and then the actual ending with Peter having everyone forget who he is, and then the stuff with MJ at the end. The movie is so damn well done. Despite my issues with the setup a little bit, the payoff is so good, and the movie is so emotionally satisfying. Number 6 is going to be the first Guardians of the Galaxy. I love this movie. It is so much fun. It is so much better than it has any right to be. When they announced they were doing this movie, I was like, have they lost their fucking mind? This is going to be their first flop.
Who are you? Star-Lord. Who? Well, Star-Lord, man.
And I didn't even see it in theaters because I didn't really know what it was. And then when I saw it at home, I'm like, damn, how is this so good? I mean, they take these ragtag group of characters and make them just so funny and so likable and so charming, and we're invested in them and their stories. The humor works so well in this movie. I said that the second one, they tried too hard with the humor. This one, all of the humor felt so organic and natural, and it all landed for me, like especially with Drax. We didn't expect Drax to be so funny, like nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too strong. I mean, come on, that is fucking hilarious. It is so much fun, great visuals, and I just love the introduction to all these characters. There's some cool action in here. Ronan is certainly one of the more generic and over-the-top villains in the entire MCU. Nebula is super over-the-top in this movie. I did not like her at first. She becomes a lot more likable as the MCU goes on. So the movie's not perfect, but I thought everything, all the interactions between the actual Guardians is what the movie is mostly focused on, and all that stuff works so well. So the movie overall just is so good. The soundtrack is incredible, probably the best soundtrack in the entire MCU, and one of the best soundtracks, period. They casted all of the Guardians so well. A movie that is just so much better than it has any right to be. Number 5 is going to be Thor Ragnarok. It actually feels a lot like a Guardians movie. It is very similar in a lot of ways, like how it balances the humor and the drama and how colorful it is, how fun it is. The reason I put this movie just slightly higher is I think it has a much better villain. I think Hela is not quite a top-tier MCU villain, but she's still quite compelling and very powerful. She is definitely evil, but also makes some interesting points about how, like when she was with Odin conquering all these planets together, how do you think she got all these gold? And then Odin decides to bury that and bury her with it. Like, that's not really fair. Now she comes back to restore Asgard to its former glory. That is somewhat understandable, given that basically Odin was the one that started all this, so it's kind of his fault. And Cate Blanchett is incredible in the role and also super hot. I mean, we get introduced to Valkyrie in this movie, who's also super hot, but super badass, and one of my favorite characters in the entire MCU now. She's just so awesome. Tessa Thompson is great, and the stuff on Sakaar is so much fun. We get Hulk in the movie, and the battle between Thor and Hulk, which is really good, and then the stuff with Jeff Goldblum is just amazing. I mean, I know he's basically playing himself, but come on. It's Jeff Goldblum. It's perfect. I mean, it's so good. And then the stuff between Thor and Loki kind of finally getting that redemption arc that is fully paid off in Infinity War. I thought that was so good. The action is awesome, and the third act is so good, especially with the inclusion of Immigrant Song, a callback to earlier in the movie. I thought that was so well done, and Thor going on the arc, learning to where he's not the god of hammers, he's the god of lightning, and fully realizes how to use his full power. So much awesome stuff about this movie, Ragnarok. Certainly there are a couple moments where the humor undercuts the drama and the tension a little bit, but I think it balances it much better than Love and Thunder did. Now, if you've been keeping track, you know that the remaining 4 movies are the 4 Russo MCU movies. I firmly believe that the Russo MCU movies are, bar none, the best MCU movies that we've gotten so far. Now, how do I order them is the question, and it was really tough, but number 4 is going to be Avengers Endgame. I absolutely love this movie. This is just a testament to how good the other 3 are. I think the movie has the highest highs of the entire MCU, but definitely is the most flawed of the 4 Russo movies. I think the first and third acts are incredible. I love the first act where we get to see our Avengers kind of sitting with the aftermath of the snap and how all of them are dealing with it. Cap with a support group, and Natasha kind of trying to find her place in the world, and Clint dealing with it in the way that he did with what happens to his family, and he goes on this rampage, and then Tony having a kid. Third act was also incredible, probably the best hour of any movie I have ever seen. I mean, it is filled with great action and great fan service, but earned fan service, stuff that was set up properly. You get the battle between Cap, Tony, and Thor versus Thanos. You get the Mjolnir, Cap wielding Mjolnir, you get the On Your Left, and then the Activate Instant Kill, the woman team up, and then Tony's ultimate sacrifice to save the world, which is a perfect conclusion to his character arc. All of the characters in this movie have either great conclusions to their arcs or have a fun future teased for them. The second act is where the movie gets bogged down just a little bit with the time travel stuff. Most of it, I think, works pretty well, and some people have issues with the semantics of the time travel. It's never going to be perfect. I thought they did a pretty good job with that in this movie. I love the stuff with Tony and his dad and Steve looking at the picture of Peggy, but it does tank the pacing just a little bit, and the movie doesn't flow super well. Also, don't really have a central villain until the new Thanos shows up, and I don't love that our final villain is a new Thanos. It's not our Thanos. But it also makes sense, given that our Thanos completed his mission and was okay with dying. I will defend the new motivations of the new Thanos to the death. I mean, it makes sense given him seeing what happened when he completed his mission and the fact that people will try to undo it, so now he wants to destroy it all and start from scratch. Totally makes sense to me. People had an issue with that. I don't get it. I don't love the Professor Hulk stuff. It would have been a lot better for me if Hulk had a redeeming moment in the final battle. One moment to be a badass Hulk. That would have made it all better. A lot of people had a problem with Fat Thor. I thought it was done perfectly. I don't think he was just the butt of a joke or an SNL skit or something like that. I think it was a great, humorous exploration of depression. I thought it was really well done. And he, unlike Hulk, gets to redeem himself in the final battle and gets to be badass and fight and be the Thor that we all know and love. Great character stuff. I think that Chris Evans, Robert Downey Jr., Scarlett Johansson, and Jeremy Renner all give possibly their best performance in the entire MCU. I mean, we get more with Clint in this movie than we've gotten before the Hawkeye show, but definitely the best Clint stuff that we've ever gotten in the MCU before that point. So much to love about this movie. Great character interactions. The action in the third act is incredible, but it certainly, I think, is the most flawed of the 4 Russo movies because of the pacing. 3 is going to be Captain America: The Winter Soldier. 2 and 3 were incredibly close, but I put this one here. Winter Soldier is great, and this is the point where I realized the MCU is for real. Like, these are not just fun superhero movies. Some of these are genuinely great movies. I came out of Winter Soldier just blown away at how awesome it was. The action is incredible, has some of the best, maybe the best hand-to-hand action in the entire MCU. I love how Steve gets a lot more fleshed out in this movie and becomes a much more complex and layered character. I mean, I liked him in the first Avenger, but he was a bit of a one-note character. We get to learn a lot more. They dig a lot deeper into his psyche in this movie. I love his interactions with Natasha. I love the introduction to Sam Wilson and his interactions with him. So much to like about this movie. It is so well paced. It is very intriguing with the spy thriller aspects to it. I think Robert Redford is a great villain, and Bucky is great as like the soldier villain, the guy that Cap is actually fighting. So much to love about this movie. It just doesn't quite resonate with me emotionally as much as my top 2 do, but Winter Soldier doesn't really do anything wrong. I think it is really, really good for what it is, and absolutely a top-tier MCU movie. Number 2 is going to be Captain America Civil War. I have always loved this movie from the first time I saw it in theaters. I completely bought into the conflict between Tony and Steve, given everything we'd seen up to this point in the MCU with their characters. It made total sense that they were each on the sides that they were, and they both made really good points. The action is awesome, the airport scene, but especially the final battle between Bucky, Steve, and Tony, and you understand where every character is coming from. I think Zemo is a great villain. People say that Zemo wasn't necessary. Yes, the hell he was. He's the one pulling the strings. He's the one that gets things moving behind the scenes. He was absolutely necessary in this movie, and is one of the best and most sympathetic MCU villains. He manages to break the Avengers apart without lifting a finger. I mean, you got to give him credit for that, if nothing else. I love the introduction to T'Challa. I actually think T'Challa in this movie might be the best that he's ever been, and I love his arc in this movie, and the inclusion of Spider-Man, even though that one didn't feel quite as natural as T'Challa's inclusion did, it was still really cool to see, and Tom Holland, of course, is great as the character. The emotions are really high in this movie, and the stakes are real, despite the fact that no one dies in this movie. The Avengers breaking up leads to them eventually losing in Infinity War, so I don't want to hear that there are no stakes in this movie. That is a bunch of bullshit. They are absolutely there. Just because no one dies doesn't mean there's no stakes. It does lead to deaths and losses down the line because the Avengers were broken up during Infinity War, and that's why Thanos was able to win. So the stakes were definitely there, and you could feel them throughout the movie. The score is also really good. It is so well-paced. I was engaged through the entire runtime. There might be a couple logic issues with Zemo's plan working out as perfectly as it did, but I don't really have any other problems with this movie. I think that Civil War is incredible. But number 1, and it's not even actually that close, is going to be Avengers Infinity War. This movie absolutely blew my mind the first time I saw it, and it has only gotten better on rewatches. I think it is basically the perfect version of this type of movie. It is this generation's Empire Strikes Back, and people will appreciate it more and more as time goes on. It is certainly not perfect. It can feel a little bit disjointed in the beginning when you're bouncing back and forth between so many different groups of characters, and it's like a half an hour before you see Tony and Doctor Strange again. But that fixes itself pretty quickly, and I don't love what they did with Bruce Banner and the writing after the first scene there, kind of bumbling around in the Hulkbuster suit. Everything else I think about this movie is perfect. Thanos is still by far and away the best villain in the entire MCU, and is super threatening and imposing and powerful, but also is kind of broken and has a very tragic backstory. And despite what he's doing, which is really bad, you understand why he's doing it. They establish from the very beginning that Thanos is a real threat. The opening scene kills off Heimdall and Loki, establishing that this is not your typical Avengers movie, that the stakes are real, that Thanos is a real threat, and that people are going to die, and that is felt throughout the entire movie, the impending sense of doom and dread. You think the Avengers are probably going to win because they always do, but you're still getting this feeling that things might not necessarily end well. The movie finds ways to sprinkle in great humor in there that doesn't undercut the tension and drama. I can't believe how well they mixed all of these different characters and franchises, and I love all the interactions between them. I thought they were so well done. The action is so good, especially the stuff on Titan, like the fight between Thanos and Tony and the fight between Thanos and Doctor Strange. There's great emotional stuff throughout the movie, like the stuff with Thanos and Gamora and her death, and Wanda having to kill Vision, and then seeing Thanos kill him again. The movie tricks you multiple times into thinking the Avengers win, and then Thanos has a trick up his sleeve and he actually wins. One of the most shocking and devastating endings in the entire MCU and in any movie ever. And people will say that, well, we know the characters are coming back. That's irrelevant for multiple reasons. It's about the journey of the surviving characters and how they deal with the loss of these characters, and we see that in Endgame. And it's about these sacrifices that our surviving characters are going to have to make in order to get the snapped characters back, which we also get in Endgame with Tony and Natasha. But that's not even really relevant because this movie ends with Thanos winning, and it's not half a movie. It is just a movie where the villain wins, and it is so well done. And the way the movie just ends with Thanos looking out on a grateful universe God, it is incredible. I can just talk about this movie so much. I'm probably going to do like an analysis video on it like I did for 7, because that's how much I truly love Infinity War. It's not just my favorite MCU movie, but like a top 20 movie of all time for me. So there you have it, guys. There's my ranking of all 30 MCU movies. I guarantee you don't have the exact same ranking. This is my list, and no one is going to have the same ranking of 30 movies. So drop your ranking below, and let's start a conversation. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe, notification bell if you enjoy my content in general and are looking to see more MCU content, which is definitely coming. I'm going to do a tier list of every single MCU character, which I don't know, it's going to be something like 200 or so characters. So that's going to be crazy and a lot of fun. So stay tuned for that and much more MCU content coming. See you soon.